I feel like it's the id visualized as cinema. It's raging, it's primal, it's brutal. A film like this shows you how lacking contemporary American cinema is in its eroticism, which is about unleashing a woman's power. Those are words from director Isabel Sandoval on Hiroshi Teshigahara's 1964 film, Woman in the Dunes. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer. And each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and this is a special features episode. And these monthly bonus episodes are outside of the filmographies of the current director in focus. Special features came about because I want to talk to someone about a film either they love or I love, and hopefully we both love. So today's film in question is Woman in the Dunes, and a quick synopsis of the film is: an entomologist on vacation is trapped by local villagers into living with a woman whose life task is shoveling sand for them. The film's tagline is the most provocative picture ever made. Apologies in advance for mispronouncing anyone's name, but the film stars Eiji Okada as Nikki Junpei, Kyoko Kishida as the woman. It's written by Kobo Abe and Eiko Yoshida, cinematography by Hiroshi Sagawa, directed by Hiroshi Teshigahara, edited by Fusaku Shuzi, and music by Toru Takemitsu. So today, for my special features episode, I have two guests with you. I have Seth Vargas and Ben Vargas. Seth, you'll probably recognize from my Agnès Varda series on the bonheur, and Ben is a new arrival. We're going to see him again in a future episode, but I wanted to have him on a little bit earlier than our slated slot for this year. So thank you both for coming on today. I really appreciate it and talking to me about Woman in the Dunes.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So Seth, I'm not going to make you reintroduce yourself. I know that you have a podcast, maybe Friends podcast that I've been on. But Ben, I'm going to ask you before I get into the second question, what your relationship is to cinema. How is it that you got into films? Because I know you're also starting, or you have started your own podcast. So if you want to talk about your relationship to the films that you love and the podcast.
My family has always been really big into movies. I mean, we used to watch movies, I feel like almost every single day. There were certain ones that we would like kind of grasp onto, and like I've probably seen Goonies 100 times. I've probably seen NeverEnding Story 100 times. Bloodsport was a big one when we were kids. Seth wasn't old enough to remember that, but we literally used to watch that sometimes multiple times in a day.
That's the Jean-Claude.
The Jean-Claude Van Damme, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen that.
I still have not seen it.
We used to do this thing when it wasn't wintertime, and in the movie, if you've seen it, it's called Kumite, which is like their fight. And we would each be a different character from the movie, and then we would play out these battles, these fight scenes. So we were really into it. It's a little embarrassing, fun. Honestly.
I think that's fun. I think it's fun to have that, as a child.
So I probably started really getting into movies seriously when I was like 15, 16. I watched predominantly foreign stuff, a lot of classics. French films were probably my favorite. Also watched a lot of, Italian and German and Polish. And I didn't get into Korean films and Japanese films until I was further along in adulthood. But now they're probably some of my favorites.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I feel like Europe is usually the gateway to the rest of the world because we talk about the European, the French, the Italian stuff more than we would Asian cinema. Do you want to talk about the podcast you're starting?
Yeah, I think we're going to have different fan bases. So I'm not sure there's a lot of crossover, but we're predominantly going to be doing kind of obscure horror stuff from, 70s, 80s, 90s. We will cover some modern stuff, probably not any new releases. It will be more on the lines of like cult classics, exploitation, horror, some like zany type of comedies, like the slapstick comedies from, 70s and 80s, stuff like that. So,
okay. Hey, I mean, people can like that stuff and like art house stuff too.
Yeah.
For the both of you, if you could recommend me and the listeners 2 to 3 films you've watched in the past few months that kind of stuck with you. They don't have to be the best movies. They're just ones that the first ones that come to your mind that you're like, you know what? I think other people should watch this.
I'm going to give you 3. Okay.
Yeah.
Real quick, rapid fire. 1 just came out, and I don't like a lot of new release films, but I did watch Bottoms in theaters, and I think that this will be a movie that this year will be remembered for. Honestly, it's so funny, and I was pretty surprised at how much I loved it. I also recently caught up on The Holy Mountain, which was a great viewing experience and just kind of left my wife and I shocked, especially by the ending. Also recently, and this is going to sound crazy, and I don't know, maybe it's not a good indication of what I like, but I watched the animated G.I. Joe film from 1987 and was blown away by that movie. It's really over the top. The character development and design is like to the nines. I sound crazy even mentioning it in the same recommendation as The Holy Mountain, but if you haven't checked it out, check it out. It's a fun little 80s cartoon, real wild.
I definitely haven't seen that, but I've seen clips from it.
Mm-hmm.
But what did you? Well, I'll look it up to see what you can watch it on. The Bottoms I haven't seen yet, but I like Emma's other film, Shiva Baby.
Yeah,
that was
great.
good. But Ben, I'd like to hear your recommendations.
Couple of movies. Faces, Places, the Varda documentary was like, I already loved her a lot, but seeing her as herself was just like, I love her even more now. Which is hard to do, but it was pretty awesome. I also liked Bacurau. I think I'm saying that right. It's a horror movie from 2019. I believe it's Brazilian. I'm not 100% sure on that. That one really was probably one of my favorite horror movies I've seen in quite a while. I also watched Police Story for the first time. Seth had it on his podcast, and that was just, I mean, I love Jackie Chan, but that was like, I don't want to say peak Jackie Chan because I haven't seen everything, but I think it might be.
It's great. I grew up with a lot of Jackie Chan stuff because my mom loves martial arts movies. Like, it's her go-to. So is Jackie Chan, like Jet Li. But I hadn't seen Police Story. I watched it like maybe 4 years ago for the first time because I realized it was also a Criterion release. And I was like, oh, yeah. I think maybe I kind of like Police Story 2 a bit more. But they're both very good. I haven't seen the third one yet.
I've heard that from some people. The second one is actually better, but I haven't seen it yet.
They're both good. They're basically the same thing. Heard of the Bacurau? I've seen the poster, but I can't do modern horror. I'm too much of a baby.
It's pretty violent. Really, so,
how do you feel about timeless horror in a sand pit?
Love it. Okay. I like real horror stuff that's like could actually happen to you. That's why I love like Hanukkah stuff. Where I'm like, yeah, funny games. Those people could come into your house and murder you.
Yeah. Do you think that you could be lowered into a sand pit and left there?
No, only because, and I was thinking about this halfway through. I was like, you know what? This could really never happen to me because I don't leave my house.
Got it. So
I would have to be having a full mentee bee to be going into the desert.
You would be the woman who has a man lowered into her pit?
Absolutely. I would be the woman who's already living there. Yeah. I would not be lured down ever. I'd be like, no, I'll die up here. Sorry, I'm good. Well, I think we're ready to get into Woman in the Dunes. Actually, before we get into some quick facts, this is the very first watch for me. It had been on my list for a very long time.
Whoa.
Like a very long time. Yeah. Ben is coming on for a later month, but I kind of wanted to have him on before. So I was creeping your letterbox and I saw it's in your top 4. I was like, okay, that's been on my list. So I hear nothing but good things. So I reached out. This movie blew my mind. So if you want to briefly talk about the first time you watched it and your like initial thoughts on the first time you watched it.
So the first time I watched it, I was absolutely blown away. I definitely had a different opinion about it from that watch to this watch. I was more mesmerized by, the cinematography and kind of the sexual side of it because it's very like erotic. There's only, I think, one scene with nudity and it's like a silhouette. It's not even like close up or anything, but it's very, just like the tension between the two of them is just like, the only thing I can compare it to is In the Mood for Love, where it's like, it's there, you're like, okay, what's going to happen next? When are they going to, consummate this like tension? But this time around, I definitely had a different perspective, but we can wait for that.
So I watched this for the first time last year, and it was on Ben's recommendation. And I don't think that we watched it together.
No.
I was doing a huge movie watch through of New to Me stuff last year, and he kept saying, Woman in the Dunes, you gotta see it. It's one of my favorite movies ever. I don't know what service I watched on and what the description was, but I was just like, how could this be interesting?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a movie that surprises you at like almost every turn. And I just remember thinking like, okay, this is like A Man Escape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a simple kind of prison escape movie, kind of like in horror, they call it Hellbilly, where a person from the city is brought out to the sticks. It's kind of like a mixture of those things. But then it ends and you're just like, okay, I don't know what this is.
Yeah. That's fair.
But I know that it's genius and that it's amazing and it's one of the best movies I've ever seen. I know that.
Well, I would agree. Well, I'm going to quickly go through the facts and then we can get into the movie because I think that's probably more interesting than the facts that I could scrape up. So the director became the first Japanese, director to be nominated for an Oscar for directing. It won the Special Jury Prize at Cannes and earned 2 Oscar nominations. So Best Director and Best Foreign Film.
I think those nominations really show how incredible this film was because we weren't that far removed from concentration camps in the United States. And this was a Japanese director. So, I mean, the people who nominated this were alive when that happened. So, I mean, just from that standpoint alone, historically, it's pretty impressive that he was nominated.
Yeah, it shows you, how the Academy has evolved and what they used to actually pay attention to back in the day. Because I was reading that it was like a huge art house film and it was so popular that they basically couldn't ignore the film. This is one of Tarkovsky's 10 favorite films.
Wow.
And when I read that, I was like, that makes sense. I feel like he'd like this movie. Oh, I mean, obviously he did. So, and then another one, which I'm going to try and condense here because there's a lot of big words because it has to do with entomology.
Oh, sure.
Which I don't know anything about. So the very first bug that you see at the beginning is often called like a doodle bug in North America. It ensnares its prey by digging out of a pit in loose sand. And when the prey falls in the pit, it's unable to get out and becomes food for that bug. I was wondering why, because I hadn't read anything about the film before I started it. So when it starts off with like him in the desert looking for these bugs and you see that bug scene, I was like, I don't know what this movie is going to be. I hope it's not like a gross out movie, but it's obviously just setting up what this movie is about. Those are just some quick facts. I'm ready to get into the movie because I know there's a lot to speak about. One of the first points I want to talk about, when you read about this film, it often gets compared to the myth of Sisyphus. For anyone who might not be familiar with that, it's essentially a man who is condemned by the gods to spend eternity rolling a boulder to the top of a hill, and it just rolls back down. He has to keep doing it over and over again. So we see that comparison in this film. This film is adapted from a book. I see the comparison, and it's the constant need to escape and the sand being something you cannot really climb. How do you guys feel about utilizing that story to kind of guide his journey in the dunes and the eventual, which we'll get to the end, but him trying to escape because that's what his goal is the entire time, is just trying to get home.
It's a fairly comparable. I think the sand is, this oppressive thing, and it's really one of the main characters of the movie. It's something that they can't escape. Throughout the film, there's constant imagery of, the sand on their bodies and, the sand inside and the sand falling, and everything they do is about the sand. I mean, they have to cover the water, they have to cover their table when they eat, and it's like this constant impending doom they just literally can't escape. So I think it's definitely a good comparison between the two.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anything that you do with the sand makes the sand move. And so there's really no like testing of anything. You see him just vaulting up like over and over. And it only makes the problem worse. And so then you have to remove more sand and you have to wait a few more days. And yeah, I definitely see Sisyphus this time around. And this really helped me kind of understand some of the woman of her like motivations or just like mindset was the allegory of the cave from Plato. And, you know, in that you have these folks who their whole life they've been chained to the wall of a cave and they see shadows on the wall in front of them. That's like the form of objects, but they don't understand the fullness of what those things are. And if you were to take someone from that cave and show them like, oh, this is what a tree is, they like wouldn't even believe you. You know, they'd be like, well, no, I know what a tree looks like. It doesn't look like this thing. They're so entrenched in the way of thinking that they've been brought up in that they just can't comprehend something else. For her to just kind of like laugh off the idea of ever leaving. And also like, well, if I did leave and went to the big city, what would I even do? He's literally talking about like freedom and she has no concept of what that is.
Yeah.
I see both of those. Like for him, it's like quicksand that he has to kind of stop struggling against in order to free like his mind, in order, you know, like he doesn't leave. We can kind of assume from the final shots of the missing persons report that he just never does leave. But once he stops struggling and once he just kind of like gets with the program, then he's found, I don't think, true happiness. I think this is a horror movie. You know, it's a pretty horrifying story, but he stops struggling against the sand by giving in.
I agree. I think this is a film where at the beginning, even before he goes into the dune, he's escaping from something, right? He's escaping from the city. And it's a thing for all of us who live in a sort of city of being like, oh, I'm going to escape to the countryside, or I'm going to escape to wherever is the countryside and wherever you're from to get away. And you live a more simple life, essentially. Not realizing that it's obviously not simple because this is not a man. He's a scholar, right? He's probably spent years of his life in school, and not because you're a scholar, you don't know how to do physical work, but he clearly has never had to do physical labor. He's put into the situation where he's like, oh, this is, now I'm trying to escape from this. So it just, his whole life is a constant escape. I was going to read a quick quote from Roger Ebert actually on the photography of the sand, because the sand obviously is basically in every single scene in this movie. And there's other films that we all probably know that have a huge element of sand. This is probably the most beautiful I've seen sand in a film, and this is in black and white. I'll read what he has to say about it. So he says, there has never been sand photography like this. No, not even in Lawrence of Arabia. And by anchoring the story so firmly in this tangible physical reality, the cinematographer, Hiroshi helps the director pull off the difficult feat of telling a parable as if it's really happening. I immediately noticed how beautiful the sand looked. I don't know, it just looked so kind of like glistening in this. And I've seen in Lawrence of Arabia, I've seen Dune. The sand in those films do not look as alluring as it does in this film. And I think it's alluring for a specific reason, because he's kind of being sucked in to this world, whether he wants it or not. How do you feel about Ebert's thoughts on, you know, the sand in the film and your own thoughts on the way the sand is photographed?
I think they definitely use time lapse in this, because I see the sand almost as water in this.
Yeah.
Which, you know, water is possibly the most dangerous force in the world. I mean, once water gets going, it's very hard to stop it, and it can do a lot of damage. And so I think in a way, I look at the water, you know, the comparison to water and sand as like this force is something that's literally destroying his life. You know what I mean? Like he can't get away from it. It's like he's drowning. I haven't seen anything where the sand is as beautiful as it is. Beautiful and yet deadly at the same time.
Yeah, the sand is I was gonna say exactly what Ben said. It looks like water. Towards the beginning, there's even a shot of him sitting in a boat in the middle of the desert. And there's this funny thing where, you know, the woman is explaining to him how the sand makes everything rot. And he's like, that's not how things work. And she's like, oh, that's how they work here. And we know he pulls moisture from the sand at the end of the film. Even some of the overlaid shots, the way that they make the sand move looks like waves. And so it gives the feeling that this house in the pit is almost like an island, that they're sequestered on, and, the ships come and drop off supplies, but they're very much isolated. Where normally, if you had a movie about the woods or the mountains or even the desert, you would have your protagonists moving through it. Like they would leave, they would walk, they would go on a journey. So to be stranded in the middle of just earth definitely gives you a lot of feelings of water.
Well, do we want to talk about what you said in terms of it being kind of an island that they're on and his escape? Because he has two. We can maybe save the very last one till later on in the discussion. But the first time he does manage to escape, he's been kind of plotting this where, in my mind, he's obviously pretending to be interested in her and forming a physical relationship with this woman. So he earns her trust to be like, okay, maybe he's accepted his fate. He will stay here. Meanwhile, he's building tools to get out. He gets out and he does run. He goes on the run, but it's a desert, right? He doesn't know what direction. At this point, he's so frazzled about getting out of this place that anyone would just run in any direction. They're like, I'm trying to get to somewhere that looks like, civilization. He eventually gets caught when he gets, stuck in the quicksand and gets pulled back. The villagers bring him right back. I guess how you feel about him escaping one hole of sand into another, and that's the reason why he's thrown back into the situation.
I mean, I think it just perpetuates the nightmare that he's in. He's like Groundhog's Day, every day it's like, oh, I'm back where I started. You know what I mean? Like there's literally no escape. He is stuck. And the quicksand, I think, just points that out. It's like, okay, this is my fate. Like I escaped and I'm still stuck in this sand. I've been thinking a lot about it since you asked me to come on, and without any hyperbole, I think this is maybe, if not the best, one of the best like horror films that I've ever seen.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Because for me, this is a literal nightmare.
Yes.
I hate the beach. I hate sand. The thought of having sand consume me in every possible way is like a literal hell for me. Yeah. So this is, there's times where, and I feel like I watched part of it with Seth. I said, the intensity of some of these scenes is like Wages of Fear, where you're just like, my heart is in my throat. I feel like I'm having a panic attack. And you're just like, this guy is just, he's completely, he has no hope. There's no hope.
I mean, as a side note to what you were saying, I also hate the beach and the sand. And the whole time I was like, man, sand's getting in their water and their food. And I could just taste the sand as they were eating. I was like, ugh. But I also just like, for me, as someone who's not a huge fan of horror, I always say that, but I do like things that disturb me. So I don't like to be scared. I like to be disturbed by things that could actually happen to people. And those are my favorite type of films. So I think to me, this is very much a horror film. And it's one of the best because you're just like, Seth asked at the top, do you think you'd be in this situation? But this could translate to any other life situation that you might find yourself in. Seth, how do you feel about the escape failure?
Yeah, so in any story, the story isn't over as long as there's hope. And that's where our story ends this time, when we've lost all hope for him ever leaving. And so it's good. That he's going to get caught. I mean, I don't know about you, but
yeah, when
I saw how much time is left, I was like, well, I don't think he gets away at this point. It is a really common, trope in horror movies that, oh, they escaped and oh, they flagged a car down. Oh, but the people in the car are in on it. Or the people in the car are the people that they're running away from. Shout out to Goonies.
Funny games too.
Funny games,
which I always talk about. Funny games.
So depending on which movie you're watching, the false escape can, suck you back in, but then you feel even more relieved when they actually escape. This is not that type of movie. And so it just kind of helps to dig you even further down than you thought you could go emotionally.
I think that's why it's a film that people talk about, and the people who have seen it, it's stuck with them because it's just the horror of living your everyday life. And his life's not in any danger other than the fact that he just doesn't want to be there, obviously, because why would you want to be? And then also kind of the horror of being like, why did she want to be here? Right? And why is she here? How long has she been here? Did she grow up here? Type of deal. I wanted to shift just to the cinematography. It's hard not to be amazed by the way this film looks, let alone the story. And I want to talk about the way that the two lead characters are shot. Because I noticed a lot of the time you kind of see them through things. Like you would see them through a window or wood slats or blinds. There's a quick quote I'll read from Midnight Eye. This says, filmed in high contrast monochrome with large portions of the screen plunged into complete darkness. Each shot is formally composed, often to the point of pure abstraction. I find we're actively being put on the outside. Like we are not in there with them. We're looking at them from the outside the same way the villagers are. We are placed as outsiders peering into kind of their sort of like a bell jar situation. They're stuck in this and we're looking at them and seeing if they can escape this jar that has no escape other than us lifting the glass. So how do you feel about the way they're shot and the fact that we're never on the inside with them? We're always on the outside.
I think there's a big parallel between what he does, what he came there to do, and his current situation, because, you know, you see the bugs digging into the dirt and him like kind of pulling them back out. Also, there is a scene where he has a bug in a tube, like a plastic tube that's closed, and the bug's trying to get out and he kind of like tilts it. The bug is like struggling to not fall to the bottom, but you know that there's like no hope. And so I think that connection is definitely intentional. And I think why the author of the book used an entomologist, because, you know, I don't want to get like all political and I'm not like a PETA person or anything like that, but there's definitely a lot of people who would see what he does as like torture, and, you know, he's putting the pin through them, and you know, we look at it as like, oh, they're just bugs, but it's also a living thing. And so that parallel, I feel like, is very intentional and very deep. And it really you could talk about just that for an hour, let alone, you know what I mean? So like,
we could really talk about just him being an entomologist that could be its own separate episode, because there's so much to say about that. I think he brought up some really great points.
As far as him being an entomologist, and all of the shots coming from outside, I didn't notice those shots till you mentioned it. I didn't see like a through line there, but I did know he knows that it's happening to him. But there's a moment he kind of still feels like he has the upper hand. He's thinking like, maybe I'll write about this one day, as he's pinning the insect to the little tray. And I'm like, look at what you're doing. Like, be in the moment that you are in. Like, realize like what you're doing to these insects is literally like what's happening to you. And even at the end, this is something that doesn't need to happen today. I could go tomorrow, or I could go, and he doesn't see his situation for what it is. And, you know, the expression that's used is like the frog in the pot. Like, he doesn't realize how bad it's getting, and he doesn't realize how far gone from himself that he is. And so, yeah, I think like in a lot of ways, he is still the observer, and he's not fully connected to like what's happening in the pit. And there's a real strange scene, which I'm sure you have on there to talk about. And it's the scene that perplexed me the most, both the first time and second time watching through it, which is when all of the villagers show up and say, hey, we'll let you see the ocean if you have sex in front of all of us.
Well, that was my next point. So you're on top of it.
And there's just a real strange new layer of voyeurism that's added to it.
Yeah.
It makes you feel strange as the audience. And I think it's saying a little bit about the audience. But when he first meets the villagers, they're not wearing masks. They're just talking to him. They're telling him there's a village nearby. They're telling him that he's going to go down into this hole. Like, nothing is really hidden as they're stealing this guy's life from him. They're very open about it. And it's very much like, it's no big deal. But when they come back and then want him to perpetrate violence against her, that's when they're now hiding. And they're all there, including like children. And they shine this spotlight on him.
Yeah.
like out of nowhere. And it's like getting him to perform for them so that he can get what he wants. And in that way, it really reminded me of a Serbian film. And, you know, this is a village government. The lengths that a government will go to and what they will kind of, you know, tease you with, or what they're holding over you in order to get you to perpetrate violence for them. And at that point, that's when it becomes kind of a nameless, faceless mob. We keep seeing the same three guys over and over, and they just kind of like peek in and like, and so he, you know, unfortunately, he does not remain a victim. At this point, he now becomes part of the system, and he becomes the victimizer. And so at the end of this film, we're not looking at the same person that we started with. And we feel bad for him, of course, but we've lost the same level of like, oh man, you got to get out of there. Oh man, you got to get out of there, that we once had. And, you know, you can blame it on what they've put him through. I mean, this is torture. Like, bringing the sand back to water, constant dripping water is literally a form of torture. And the constant dripping of the sand, that's going to have a toll on you. And when someone is tortured, they become a different person. Like, they're reduced down to something that they were not before. Very much. I'll get into that. So I did want to talk about the sexual dynamics between them. Yeah. I mean, I watched this on Criterion, and the description of it kind of makes it seem like it's an erotic thriller. And I guess you can view it that way. When I was watching this, I was like, this is not an erotic thriller to me. This is something else. There's eroticism in it, or the sex. I don't know if I would call it erotic. So I just thought it was, I don't know what I thought it was. I didn't know anything about him getting trapped down there. I just thought it was two people on a getaway having sex in the sand. Like Zabriskie Point, essentially. And I was like, this is not that. The sexual dynamics between them, you feel it right away in the sense of her. So when he first gets there and he starts taking off his gear, he's taking off the extra layers because he's warm. There's a shot of her, and she's kind of surrounded by darkness, and you can see that she's enamored by him either as a man, as a body, or him specifically. At that point, you don't really know. You just figure she lives alone. She hasn't seen a man in a while, and she's turned on by this. Then you get the fact that, you know, he goes to sleep, he wakes up, he sees her nude, and she's kind of like covered in a thin layer of sand, and he's kind of shocked. He's like, why would she be sleeping in the nude with the random man sleeping there? And he's trying to wake her up to be like, okay, I'm gonna go now. Thanks for dinner last night, type of deal. Then he figures out he's trapped. And then you get this scene where they're kind of like touching each other, and then you can feel, okay, there's some sort of sexual tension. I always read it, even during that scene, as he is just doing this as a way to get out. I don't know how you read it. If you felt that at some point he actually wants to sleep with this woman, he's attracted to her, or that he's immediately off the bat trying to use this as a way to get out. That's how I read it.
So in the very beginning, when the villagers take him to her house and they're yelling down and they're like, hey, old hag, like, you know. Yeah. And he gets down there, and there's a scene where he looks at her. Immediately his face changes, and he's like shocked because he's expecting, you know, probably some old lady, and some old nice lady who's going to let him stay in her house for the night. And then you also see her look at him. So I definitely think that there is attraction on both sides. Yes, he does use that as like his way of like trying to get away, but I definitely think that there's some type of like connection between the two of them.
That's fair.
I really think that this movie is one of like the best examples of Stockholm syndrome, because, you know, we don't have to talk about it till the end, but, you know, you fight and you fight and you fight. But then there's also, I think somewhere in his mind, there's also like the simplicity of it, where it's like, you know, his life back in the big city is not great. And yes, he uses that as a way to escape, but I definitely think that there's something going on there.
Ben brought up a great point when we rewatched this the other night, which is the possibility that the first time that they have sex with each other doesn't happen. And I hadn't thought about it before, but, you know, he basically was saying they wake up in completely separate rooms, and before it happens, they're both extremely dehydrated, and the guy drinks a bunch of alcohol. It's a very unsexy sex scene. It's very, very strange. I really had never thought about it like that, but I think it's possible.
I hadn't thought of that. That does make sense, because that's what I'm saying. It's like there are sex scenes in this film, but I don't find it, at least to me, I don't find it necessarily sexy. It's kind of like two desperate people who are clinging on to each other, as opposed to like a lust. That is a kind of underlying thing. It's weird that this film is often associated with those scenes, at least from when you kind of read about it briefly. They always talk about how it's erotic, when I think it's so much more than that, especially when we're leading up to the scene that we talked about briefly before, of the village people asking or compromising, being like, you can go see the sea if you essentially rape this woman in front of us. And he says to her, okay, why not? Let's just do it. And she says, well, we're not perverts. And he says, well, we're already living like animals anyway. So he just views her as kind of an animal to be taken advantage of. And he's just forcing her and he's pulling her out. And that scene, I don't even think you had to be a woman to just be kind of mortified at like, okay, what's happening? And you're like holding your breath and you're hoping this is not going to actually happen, even just for the actual act. Just that's mortifying. And then at some point he says, let's just pretend.
Yes.
And she just is saying no. And you're like, I don't know, my heart broke for her when she's just so upset, saying you idiot to him. And he eventually does give up. He's so selfish that they're only offering him something, right? They're not offering her anything out of this. It's only him who can go see the sea. As we said, this is where your thoughts of him change from being like, I feel totally bad for this guy, to being like, oh, well, this guy's the dickhead, but he's also now being pushed so far into his entrapment that his mindset is changing. Or did he always have this in him type of deal? So how do you feel about that shift? And then you kind of have the ritual happening at the top with the mass and the music, and it's like intense. We're opening the second chapter to the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, you can almost equate it to people who go to the zoo. They will actually schedule like, hey, the pandas are going to mate, and everybody goes and watches it. And it's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And it's like, they're just on display for the pleasure of the villagers. It's that voyeuristic, we're all watching their misery, which this has like some connections to a lot of like De Palma films, because De Palma will a lot of times make us the voyeur, where we're watching and we're almost culpable because we're watching it, like we know we shouldn't be watching this, but we're like almost forced to watch it. So, I mean, yeah, it's a horrifying scene. I mean, the masks are scary. And then there's like, I didn't notice it until the third time I watched it, but there's like a scene where I think it's supposed to be one of the drummers, but the way the camera is shooting him, it almost looks like he's like masturbating. The camera's literally like shaking, like he's shaking. And it's like, oh, okay. So like, this is just, these people are just sick, and yeah, it's a very terrifying scene. Not fun to watch.
No.
It feels very much like a hazing ritual for him. In the States, anytime we see masked figures and flames, we're going to think of the Ku Klux Klan. There's like a crowd madness that kind of takes over. And we know like when that happens, people do like crazy things and they're trying to draw them in. And it is so sad for her, because one of the reasons that she stays there, beyond like not knowing what she would do in the real world, is because her family is buried there. Her husband and her child are buried there. And to her, at no point is she not accepting of him joining her in this life. Like when they wake up, she's just like, yeah, this is what we do. And here, grab a shovel. And she's showing him the beadwork thing that she's doing to earn extra money. And for the most part, she's completely happy. She has a companion now, and she's totally willing to bring him into her normal life. What is normal to her? He is the one who's resisting it. In that scene, even though she's part of the villagers, she's like, well, we're not perverts. And this, that's not what this relationship is. She thinks that she has basically like a new husband. For him to betray her on that is so sad. Like, it's really, really sad, because she thinks, my life is going to go back to normal now. And he ruins it by forcing her out and trying to rape her.
It also reminded me of there's a scene where he asks her, how many other men had there been before me in his position? And she names off a few. I don't know if I missed it. You don't really kind of get what happened to them. Did they escape? Did they die or whatnot? I know she said some of them are still there. Some of the younger people that got captured essentially are still in other houses. For me, I was wondering, I'm like, did she strike a deal with the village people to be like the next man that comes? Okay, he's coming to me. Or was it just sort of they assign people to whoever they get? How you feel that works out, because he obviously wasn't the first. And what happened to those other men?
They don't really specifically talk about that, but I mean, my guess is that they maybe share. She had him for a while, and so they send him to somebody else's house who doesn't have a companion. Because they also talk about when you have a man, you get like extra rations. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that part of the movie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe it's some type of, you get him for 6 months and then, you know, your neighbor gets them for 6. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
It does feel in a way some like connection to like cults too, where it's like they're living this bizarro life, but for them it's just completely normal. And so for an outsider, it's like, wait, this is what you do every day. And I will say there's a part of me that this is, in a way, it's not that it's idyllic, but it's kind of attractive. Like, you know, at night you get up and you shovel, and then the rest of the day you just kind of hang out and chill and eat food. And if you had a companion, like, I mean, you know, it wouldn't be the worst life, in my opinion, outside of the crazy villagers, but
yeah, well, that's exactly that. I think it's it's playing on the fact that there are people who do that, who go away on like a retreat of some sorts to escape from their city lives, because the city life is overwhelming them, and they think that going in the middle of nowhere is going to be better for them, for their mental health or physical health, because it's so different. But when you're faced with that every day, then you either realize, oh, this is for me, or it's not, right? Some people can live like that, and some people cannot. He obviously felt at the beginning that he couldn't, and he eventually does.
I think them mentioning that they've got other people is just another nail in the coffin of our hope, because it's proving that they have a system in place that works. Like, if they had said something like, oh, well, this is the first time we've ever done this, and we don't really know what we're doing. Nope. Yeah. They know how to trap him. They're not worried about it. They get him down in the hole, and then he's stuck there. And he knows this has happened over and over and over again. Which,
again, ties it back to what we were talking about at the top about, you know, Sisyphus. So just, this is like a never-ending cycle that just will continue even past, clearly, if we're talking about the ending here quickly, of her being carted up. We don't see what happens to her. Do we know if she comes back or whatnot? He stays on, and who says that they're not going to trap, say, a woman for him and just continue that cycle? Before we talk about the ending, though, I did want to quickly talk about the score of this film.
Amazing.
Because it blew my mind. And I will say quickly that it reminded me right off the bat of, well, that didn't remind me, but I just was like, okay, there's no way that Johnny Greenwood wasn't inspired by this when he was making Therapy Blood, because it has that kind of grating strings going on. And it just, right off the bat, you get it. And you're like, okay, now I kind of know what I'm in for, but not fully. And anytime it does show up, it's at the right moments. How you feel about the score of this film and how it works?
I'm not typically a score guy. One of my favorite theater experiences was No Country for Old Men. And the lack of music. In fact, I don't think there's any music at all. I think there's zero score. And I find that to be very haunting, the lack of music, because in film, music is, you know, set up for cues. Like, okay, you're watching a horror movie and the music gets creepy. Okay, we know something bad's going to happen, right? And so when you take that away, there's no guide. So it's just like your imagination, which to me is always worse, the imagination. This movie, I mean, this score is so perfect. After hearing about, you know, the director getting nominated and Best Foreign Film, the fact that the score wasn't nominated, which maybe back then they didn't do those, but I'm pretty sure they did, right? Like Best Original Music and stuff.
Pretty sure they did. They must.
Yeah.
Have.
So, I mean, the fact that this didn't get nominated is insane to me, because it's one of the most effective scores of really any movie that I can think of.
I agree.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And a lot of the times it comes after the surprise, like as a punctuation mark to something that has already happened, which isn't totally unique to this film, but it just keeps getting you over and over. Like, as I was rewatching, I was like, they got me. But yeah, it's fantastic. And if you had any, second guesses about like what type of film you're watching, the score makes it very clear what you're watching. And real quick note about the beginning, the movie starts out with the opening credits and we hear the sounds of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also see all of these different maps, like topographical maps, city maps. And he has this whole speech about the different forms that are used to identify us. And he's like, licenses. And he goes all the way down. He names every possible form of documentation that is used to like document a person, right? And I think he says something like, did I think of all of them? And then later on in the film, he lists off all of the branches of government that will come looking for him. And all of those things fail. Nobody cares. And the way that the film ends, basically back in the city with this form, the form that defines his life and what his life is missing for 7 years. And so it's like he has slipped into, for lack of a better term, a pit of despair that is just off the map and off the radar. And it is a little surreal, this film. One of the things that I saw was like, they filmed it in a real place, but this could never really happen the way that it does happen. Just like the angles of the walls are way too steep for sand to be piled up like that. The actual walls were built with like sand plastered to them, and then they would pour sand down them. So it's a little surreal in that way. It's a little bit like a parable. It's a little bit like a fable, where we know that like a house made of gingerbread or an old woman couldn't actually live in a shoe. But we have that like odd setting to kind of like displace us. And then the story can tell us what it wants to tell us. I just feel like the sound kind of helps guide you subconsciously a little bit through that journey for him.
I agree. And I do like that you said that it happens after kind of like the shock factor, which usually you would kind of have it happening at the same time or just before it to kind of amp you up for it. But now the score is great. I was like, well, Halloween's coming up. Maybe I could play it as the kids come to the door right after they leave. Just
You're going to be the woman in the dunes?
I might. That might be my Halloween costume. Well, I think we're naturally getting to the end of the film. But before that, I just wanted to ask you guys, is there anything that you wanted to bring up that we haven't covered before we get into kind of how we feel about his final escape? And
I mean, I could talk about this movie for another 3 hours, but
yeah, I know.
I feel like we've gotten the majority of the big stuff.
Gist.
So.
The only note that I had is about the family relationship and like how we watching this film will say, she's crazy. Like, she's crazy for going along with this and for thinking that this is good. She says that the village leaders are good to her and that the places that they sell the sand to, that they're good to them. She's happy where she is. Again, like, we think, oh, that's so crazy. But how many people live where they live because that's where their family came from? You know, like, they're miserable there. They're working a job that's literally, I work to pay for where I sleep so that I can wake up to go to work. And we are fine with that. And, if you ask someone like, oh, where are you from? Like, well, I live around here. Why? Like, well, my family's here. We just accept it. But in her case, it's like to this extreme that seems crazy. But I think we're all kind of crazy for not trying to. And again, like, to bring it back to like Plato's cave, it's like, we don't even know what we're missing out on. And when someone presents us with freedom, like through ignorance and being repressed by the government and through like torture, we're even skeptical of freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've been looking for a sign to move out of your hometown, this is it, dear listener.
Yep. I'm ready to talk about the ending. We've kind of talked about what happens. So she's taken up. Immediately, I don't know if it was just as a woman, if you kind of knew what was happening to her, I kind of figured it was like a pregnancy gone wrong. I was like, how has she not gotten pregnant yet?
Yeah.
I knew that there was something gone wrong. And so they take her out. She's like moaning, no, because she doesn't want to leave. The ladder is left down for him. He kind of tugs on it to make sure this is real, that they're not, messing with him. And he climbs up. I think the look on his face, and the actor does such a great job. Like both the actors do such a great job. I know we haven't really talked about the acting as much, but he does a great job of, there's a look in his face where I'm like, I don't think this man wants to leave. Even when he's climbing up those stairs, he's so hesitant. And so he kind of looks and then he goes to the sea and you're like, okay, what's going to happen? And then all of a sudden it cuts back to him being like, I got to check on my water pit, that I'm building. and it leaves it up to the audience. I'm sure that the book does as well, to be like, has his mind gone fully kind of insane? Has he accepted his fate? Does he want to be there? Is he going to eventually escape? Or is this just going to be his life and he's going to continue the cycle? How do you guys feel about that? Because it is open to interpretation.
I think the water, it brings him some type of like accomplishment that he maybe feel he never was able to achieve in his everyday life in the city. So I think part of it is like, he's like, oh, I'm not completely helpless. I can do something that's going to better my life. And again, the Stockholm syndrome thing of like, it becomes romantic in a way, it's like, I'm not dealing with the hustle and bustle and my job that I probably don't love. And yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would have made that decision, but I can see from his standpoint, while maybe it's that he has gone a little bit insane, but I also think there's probably some type of like romantic feeling that he has for that at this point,
I think that's a great point. I think the romanticism of his escape, especially if you're from a city, you live in a city, is really prevalent. I think, not to keep bringing it back to the pandemic, but I know a lot of people were leaving cities because they couldn't afford to live there during the pandemic and going back to either their hometowns or to further out. And then you see them coming back because they're like, oh, I've never grown up on a farm. I don't know how to deal with the farm. I don't know this farm life. And it's like, as someone who's from a small town, I know that. But occasionally I'll meet someone, I'm like, you have never lived outside of the city. You've never lived outside of a place that didn't have public transportation. You've never lived in a place where you needed to drive everywhere. So you can romanticize a place that's so far removed from you, not realizing that doesn't mean that your life's going to be easier.
I think from the beginning, he is very enamored with making a name for himself. And seemingly it's in an innocent way, catching bugs. But what happens to him his first day, well, not his first day, but, day one, he's so enamored with catching these bugs that he misses the last bus home in the desert. That's not a light thing. That's not like, oh, I missed the last train and, I'll just wander around the city or hang out in a pizza shop all night. He's already clueless to the danger that he is in because he's so obsessed with some kind of recognition. He says, like, maybe they'll put my name in a book. Oh, great. Wow, amazing. And at the end of the movie, he's in the same spot. He finally feels like, oh, I do have a hand up on this situation. Oh, I am kind of in control and I can leave any time I want, really. Like, I could leave tomorrow. I could leave. I've done it before. Look, they were careless and left the ladder here now. I mean, do I need to leave right now? I don't need to leave. My water thing is just starting to work. And he says, he's like, eventually, maybe I will tell the other villagers. And so the desire to be a big fish in a little pond just kind of transfers from one pond to another for him. And I think it's a really great warning for us to check our motivation on like why we're doing what we're doing. And if we're kind of blind to the dangers that are around us, it's a real tragic film that he doesn't really have an arc that goes up. It's just an arc that kind of dips way down and then he comes back to exactly where he was, just in a much smaller prison than his, dead end teaching job.
There's a real darkness there.
This movie ends, and I think this is the kind of film like Paris, Texas, like Jean Dielman, where you say, oh, I'm going to watch movies differently now because I'm kind of seeing what movies can do in a way that I didn't know they could do before.
Yep, I feel that.
They're speaking of like movies that change your life and your perspective. There's a documentary called Working Man's Death, which if you haven't seen it, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I watched that movie probably 20 years ago. I watched it when it came out, basically, and it has impacted me to this day. I still think about it at least once a year. People are always like, well, why do you watch such depressing movies? Why do you watch sad movies? Why do you watch movies that are terrible? And I think the reason why I like it is because it gives you perspective. I think one of the most important things in life is perspective, because it's very easy to get down. It's very easy to say, I'm a loser. My life is terrible. But if you have perspective and you realize, oh, I'm not trapped in a sand pit, or my job isn't like, crawling into a mine to try and find like some mineral. It's like, oh, my life is actually pretty good. And I think when you watch films that are only for escapism, it just perpetuates that my life is not good enough. The woman finds like, the super hot guy and her life is great. And it's like, oh, well, I don't have that. And so it just like it just increases that where when you watch something bad or depressing or sad, it's like, oh, my life's actually not that bad in comparison. And so I think movies like this, it's just adds to that level of like, perspective where it's like, oh, okay, I don't have to dig sand every night.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And it's not like something that's not natural in a sense, like it's not creating a story that's so horrible that you can never imagine this happening to someone. It's like this could happen to someone. Same with like Lars von Trier movies where I would not want to live in any of those movies, but those things could happen to people, probably have happened to people. And that's why I enjoy watching those films, as you said, Ben. Just to put things into perspective, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I'm not living in Breaking the Waves. So I guess I could, not hate my life for today.
Dancer in the Dark.
I would love to live in Breaking the Waves.
Maybe in the Scottish countryside, but not around those people.
Sure.
That's fair. I do have a funny thing that I thought of. I am very much against remakes of great films, but the main character in this, he's very attractive, I think.
Yeah, he is.
And he actually reminds me of a Japanese version of Pedro Pascal. There are some scenes where you're like looking at him, you're like, oh, that looks kind of like Pedro Pascal. So I was thinking if I would love to see a remake of this, but with Pedro Pascal as the main character.
I would accept it if it was him.
Right.
Very much.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that when I was watching this. I was like, I'm surprised no one's tried to remake this film. And then I was thinking about, I hope they don't. But if it was with the right cast, because this is very much an actor driven, although the visuals obviously are very strong.
If this movie was around today, people would, I think, like fall in love with this guy.
Yeah.
Like the terms that they would use, they would call him like a daddy. You know what I mean? Like he's very attractive in like a very attainable way. He's not like a Cary Grant where it's like, he's like this unattainable beauty, but he's just like an everyday dude. But
our main actor was also in Hiroshima, Mon Amour. And that's where I recognized him. I was like, why do I recognize this guy? Because he's obviously really attractive then. So he's obviously like, must have been like some sort of, maybe heartthrob's not the best word for him in Japan at the time, but he was a very attractive man. And that's why you could like have him in this role. It would be very believable that she would immediately be like, not feel threatened by him, be attracted by this man because he's an attractive guy. I would like to move on to the very last segment of the show, which is end credit. And for this, I will just ask the double bill question. So if you're creating a double bill, either for yourself or other people, film would you pair this film with if you're presenting it to someone, and why?
I really struggled with this one because I truly haven't seen anything like it. I think that's why it has stayed near the top of my list for so long, because there really isn't anything like it, in my opinion. But my initial thought was Straw Dogs by Peckinpah with Dustin Hoffman. Seth had brought up, the whole Hellbilly, Deliverance and films like that. And it definitely has that vibe just in like, I don't know if they have those kind of movies in Japanese culture, but so the Straw Dogs, Misery, even though it's not the same, it still has that like, he's just there for her benefit basically, and he's trapped there. And I think those would probably be the two. I also, if I was just going to do a double bill for movies that would give you anxiety, I think I would probably put this with Wages of Fear.
Those are good.
I think you would lose your mind after, 4.5 hours of watching these two movies. But
yeah, I feel that. I feel like the first two were along the waves of what I picked for mine, but Wages of Fear would also be great. You'd just be kind of sweating towards the end of it.
I have a triple feature.
Okay.
And the theme would be the traps that we lay for ourselves and that society lays for us.
Okay.
So I would kick off with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Mm-hmm.
I would then go to Eyes Wide Shut, and then I would finish out with Woman in the Dunes. And it's a triple feature about masks, the things people do under masks and the masks that we wear for each other, the pain that we inflict on each other, especially in a man and a woman relationship.
Mm-hmm. What about the mask?
Maybe not the mask.
I've already shared my thoughts on the mask. It's not. Here's the thing. It's not bad, but I don't see the love for it.
Do you think
That's
it is
about it.
bad?
Well, see, it was an appropriate pick for that podcast.
That's
Shout
true.
out to Nick. Bad movies we love. I kind of went the route of, even though as the movie ended, I felt differently about her, but as the beginning, you're kind of led to believe that she's entrapping him in a sort of way. So I kind of went with 3 different movies that I'll just quickly name off of women who kind of entrap men. So we got Possessed by Curtis Bernhardt from 1947. It's Joan Crawford, who's madly obsessed with Van Heflin in this movie. He's telling her several times, I'm not interested, and she cannot hear it. And she just, possesses him. It's a very good movie. Would highly recommend. Another one is Leave Her to Heaven, John M. Stahl, 1945. Gene Tierney, also obsessed with this man and is willing to commit murder to get him. So there's that. And then the third would be Angel Face, which is Otto Preminger, 1952. It's Gene Simmons and Robert Mitchum. And she's also just very obsessed and entrapping him, getting him to work for her family so that she can have him nearby. So it's just, if you're going for that route, I feel like I would start off with one of those and end with Woman in the Dunes, because I feel like in the end, she's not really entrapping him. It's more so the villagers, and she needs that extra hand. But if you want that other perspective, and then to give you more perspective into her mindset, and with Woman in the Dunes. But it's hard to also, I feel like, follow up any film with Woman in Dunes. It has to be the second one you watch.
Yeah, I think it has to be at the end.
Yeah, like you can't watch Woman in the Dunes and then, The Mask. I mean, maybe I could, but...
Do you feel like there's any connection to Sunset Boulevard with this movie? With that relationship between the main character and the butler? And
very much. That would also be another great one to pair it with, just to have this woman who's clinging on to someone who doesn't want to be there but knows that this is probably the better option for them, because outside of this they don't have much, and this person has more to offer them despite the fact that they don't want to be there. This seems to be a theme that runs in a lot of art.
Yeah.
Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Women in the Dunes.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thanks. This was great.
Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia Moroni. Intro music by Lamar Walker. And if you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. While you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast.